Reparations. During slavery, slaves suffered within a system characterized by undernourishment, overwork, hard punishment, ill health, and despair. They were sold into slave markets to different owners of plantations and were bound to be separated from each other. Thus, they lost their nation, their dignity, and were dehumanized and exploited by whites. My major attempt is to go into depth about the insights of the struggles of Black African American people for their survival in such an environment, and why the United States government should pay African Americans reparations to compensate for slavery. In the period of post-slavery, early 20th century in southern United States, where Blacks were still treated awfully by white people. Even after the abolished law of slavery in 1863, they were still named as colored. Nothing much else changed for African American lives. Though the laws of elimination of slavery were made because now the slave system became a new way of life. The system was accepted as destiny. So, the whites also got a license to take the disadvantages and started to exploit Black people sexually, racially, physically, and economically. Yet, the debate about reparations for slavery is not a new one. And the history of the idea shows just how many roadblocks there are to a meaningful conversation about the topic. Slavery and its later effects upon the lives of African Americans or Africans who were brought forcibly into America as slaves, and even after slavery were treated inhumanely. This is the reasoning why many people believe reparations should be offered to African Americans and should be represented accordingly. A major justification for the government paying reparations directly to individuals or establishing other forms of compensation, such as investment in majority Black communities, lies in the harsh reality of the labor stolen from millions of enslaved people from 1619 to 1865. That justification extends to many more millions severely oppressed for the next century and a half. Whether through racist segregation laws or informal discrimination, authorities did nothing to stop. Since 1619, when the first enslaved African was taken to Jamestown, Virginia, the oppression of Black people by whites has been embedded in America's economic, political, and educational and other institutions. An 18th century newspaper ad announcing the sale of 250 fine, healthy Negroes, AP photo, slavery lasted for nearly 250 years. About 60% of the U.S. history, including colonial times, counting the nearly century-long Jim Crow segregation of African Americans, officially sanctioned racial oppression included more than 80% of the U.S. history to date. The political scientist Thomas Kramer calculated the hours worked by enslaved Black workers between 1776 and the official end of slavery. He estimated the uncompensated labor totaled between 5.9 and 14.2 trillion in current dollars.
And hopefully get this bill passed into law. But I'm not waiting, because there's a lot of folks in my neighborhood who want the scales balanced now. And that's why I've been pushing a lot of legislation with specifically, as I designed it, to deal with these inequities. We need to figure out what the larger plan is. That's why I'm leading on the Senate version for H.R. 40. But right now, again, people in my community don't have time to wait. My baby bonds plan, which would be putting $1,000 into the bank accounts of every American child born, and then based upon income every year, you can get deposits in the account. The lowest income people would get $2,000. The with compounding interest, by the time a child is 18 years old, the lowest income kids would have upwards of $50,000 of wealth now to invest in things that create generational wealth: education, buying a home, starting a business. As Columbia University analyzed that, it would collapse the racial wealth gaps between blacks and whites. That would make a real difference in this community where so many children are born below the poverty. And I just want to
Told in the book, Racist America, trillions more in wealth was effectively stolen from Black Americans, not just because of enslavement prior to 1776, but during the Jim Crow era, through unemployment, discrimination, and decades of bureaucratic manipulation that caused them to lose farmland. It is estimated that the total cost of Black Americans over 4 centuries of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and more contemporary discrimination to be in the $10 to $20 trillion range. On the other hand, opponents of this reparations effort voice 2 common arguments against slavery. They say slavery happened too long ago, and not all white Americans have slave-owning ancestors. Similar arguments are now commonplace. The assumption of those debts are owned by and to people now deceased ignores all the money, property, and other wealth white Americans alive today inherit from their forebears, including slave owners and many others responsible for depriving blacks of economic and educational opportunities through discrimination. Most whites can track their roots back at least 3 generations, with many going back between 4 and 20 generations. That's longer than most African Americans have had, at least officially. Fairly equal sub-economic opportunities at most for 2 generations. This argument also ignores the benefits white people reaped from a large-scale discrimination suffered by African Americans, whose labor was underpaid or stolen for most of U.S. history. Millions of people, many still alive today, endured brutal violence and economic discrimination under legal segregation. While the 13th Amendment abolished chattel slavery in the United States in 1865, there was no help to the formerly enslaved population, which numbered approximately 4 million. The policy, popularly referred to as 40 acres and a mule, a promise by the federal government to redistribute land to former slaves, but unfortunately was never given. This reluctance to reparations seems puzzling in the light of the fact that the U.S. government successfully pressured post-war German government to pay Holocaust survivors $927 million, worth $8.84 billion today, in compensation as part of the 1952 Lexington Agreement. And after the passage of 1989 reparation laws, the U.S. government also modestly compensated some 82,000 Japanese Americans who were discriminatorily incarcerated as enemy aliens during World War II, with $20,000 payment made to each surviving person who had been detained. Although reparations seem far out of reach, new policies in Chicago and at Georgetown University suggest a specific set of conditions that could lead to action an institution guilty in the past and still in existence. A discrete and undefinable population able to show that if their ancestors suffered any harm during slavery, and a community to fight on the applicant's behalf. At the local level, activists have more immediate access to institutional pressure points, while decision makers often less shielded from criticism and thus more likely to yield. That class of organization can include cities and schools, as well as churches, the military, and even corporations. Thus far, reparation payments from such institutions, whether realized or promised, have totaled to about $10 million. And who knows, this could be just the beginning. All politics is local for now, so are reparations. My question for you is, do you believe that African Americans deserve reparations from all the trauma and mistreatment that they have been put through from the past years? And if so, how much money is an appropriate amount of money to give African Americans?
There are diverse opinions in this room, and I understand it, appreciate it, respect it, admire it, and love it. I'm a product of my history. I am clearly a child that has walked this path. No, I did not pick cotton. But I will say that those who picked cotton created the very basic wealth of this nation. For cotton was king. There was no other product.